Thank you for joining us today. We'll be talking about Indian science in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're at the Infosys Science Foundation and we're being joined by Professor Gagandeep Kang, a professor at the Christian Medical College in Vellore, and S. Gopalakrishnan, co-founder of Infosys Limited and President Board of Trustees, Infosys Science Foundation. Thank you both for joining us today to talk about the topic of the moment, really, the biggest challenge facing not just Indian science, but much around the world. Professor Kaur, to start with, a question on the minds of so many of us. Is there going to be a third wave in India? And if so, when? I know these are big questions with no definite answers, but what are your thoughts on this?
If we look at the situation as it is today, it appears extremely unlikely that we will have a third wave that in any way resembles the second wave. If we don't have a variant that is capable of completely escaping the immune response and being able to spread at least as fast or not, if not faster than the Delta variant. So with that caveat, no third wave. But I think the reason for that is important to understand because a lot of people are very worried. And the reason is that we have high vaccination rates and we have very high seropositivity rates in our population. Both of those make it very unlikely that we have enough susceptible people to sustain a third wave.
Well, that is very good news again, because the second wave was so terrifying and so devastating that I think it's good news to know that very possibly there is not going to be a third wave. That is wonderful. Mr. Gopalakrishnan, does Indian science have the funding right now needed to fight pandemics? I'm talking about both the government and the private sectors as well. Both were involved in this fight. Is the funding enough, or do you feel that it needs to be enhanced in any way?
So the answer is yes and no, because we just vaccinated 100 crore people. We found money, we found resources, we found manufacturing capability to vaccinate 100 crore people. Some of those vaccines were created in India and of course manufactured in India. So in that sense, the answer is we have the funding. But having said that, I strongly believe that we need to invest significant more money, not just in research, but in our healthcare infrastructure. The pandemic has shown gaps in our healthcare system. And again, not just in India, it has shown the gaps that exist everywhere in the world. And so we need to invest significantly more money. We need to make sure that healthcare is accessible to everybody. It's an inclusive thing. And I strongly believe that India has a significant role to make vaccine accessible and inclusive, because we are the only low-cost manufacturer. So when you look at the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, it's really targeted towards the top 10% of the world's population, whereas India's vaccine is targeted towards 100% of the world's population.
You mentioned two things. One is vaccines made in India and also accessibility to all. Professor Kang, schools are opening again now. Karnataka also has just opened 1st to 5th standards. Vaccines are not yet being given to children. How do you see that? How do you assess that situation?
I think this is a situation that a lot of people worry about because intuitively, with everything that we've grown up with in the healthcare system, we vaccinate children first and then we come to adults. And this time we are doing it in reverse.
We started with the senior citizens and came downwards, yes.
And I think for that it's very important to understand the reason. And the reason is that this is a virus that when it infects children, your immune system is capable of handling it very easily. If you're a healthy child, you have very little to worry about in terms of the infection. It will mostly be asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic. However, if you acquire this infection after you're over the age of 60, 65, 70, the higher up you go, the greater the risk of severe disease. That's why it was important to protect the elderly first. And we are doing an age descending strategy. At some point in the future, we might make the decision to vaccinate children, but now is not the time for that.
Now is not the time, even though schools are opening.
That's correct.
The fear of children taking infection back to their parents.
Well,
and
we hope
grandparents.
that their parents are vaccinated.
So that would be the protection there. Also, of course, India's just marked that 1 billionth vaccination. We've passed that. Given the size of our country, the population that we have, and the time frame, how do you assess that achievement, that milestone?
I think we've done a phenomenal job. I know that there were targets set earlier that we didn't quite achieve, but I think those targets, may have been aspirational in a sense. But for a country with our population, we are doing an absolutely phenomenal job of getting the vaccines out. But it's important to remember that 25% of our adult population has not yet received a single dose of vaccine. So we need to make sure that those people are identified and vaccinated as soon as possible. Good to get the first dose out and then follow up with the second dose.
Absolutely. Now, of course, every country was to some extent taken by surprise by this pandemic, the scale of it, the challenges of it. From what you have seen of India's scientific community, was it ready? Was it ready for this pandemic? Is it ready for future pandemics? What do you feel was needed? What was good? What was bad about India's scientific response to this?
So, were we ready? Probably not, because it caught all of us by surprise. And because of the scale, because of how widespread this has been, clearly it showed a lot of gaps in the healthcare infrastructure, even in the ability of the scientific infrastructure. It's really not the scientists; it's the scientific infrastructure.
The testing, all the other things.
All the sequencing, finding out which variants are prevalent in which location. All of these things had to be scaled up during the crisis, and probably will require further investment in the future. What I'm confident about is about the capability of Indian scientists. I believe that they are second to none, and they can given the proper investment, proper equipment, they can actually face any challenge. We need to, of course, scale up the number of scientists, number of people getting into science. We need to scale up, and I hope, if there is one silver lining in this, it's our, dependence on science, or our clear, we've now understood how science can help society, right? So I hope more students, more children think about a career in science.
Yes, I think it has brought science to the foreground in this battle, really. Professor Kang, we spoke about 25% of the population, the proportion being fully vaccinated, the need to get everybody vaccinated. What for you, again, given our population, would be a reasonable target, a deadline to get the adult population vaccinated?
Well, the proportion of the population that we should be looking at vaccinating is above 90%, because the Delta variant has a reproductive number that's much higher than the ancestral virus. So if the ancestral virus was 2.5 or 3, then the Delta variant is somewhere above 6.5. So that means that you need to vaccinate a lot of the population, and I wouldn't set a last date to do that. I'd just say let's do as much as we can, as fast as we can.
And the last mile is always a challenge, because you do still have people who have that hesitancy, that last 5-10% of people who may even say everybody else is vaccinated, I needn't be. Any suggestions to get over that last block, that last mile?
I think if you look at vaccine hesitancy, it's a spectrum. There are people who are eager for vaccines, really want to get them, were first in line at booking their appointments. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have people who say, I will never get a vaccine because it's an invasion of my body. In the middle, you have all the other people that you can talk to about vaccines and why. I think the most important thing to do is to respect people's position and listen to them. And I think we tend to have a fixed position ourselves and expect everybody to come to our position. But people have very genuine concerns
Yes.
that may not have been expressed because the people they were interacting with weren't willing to listen. So I think listening and responding when a response is asked for is the best way to try and communicate with people the value of vaccines, not just for individuals, but for their families and communities as well.
Yes, and the gap also between the people taking the first vaccine, several not turning up for the second dose, that also is, there may be a feeling I've taken one, I'm fine. That also I think needs to be communicated as well.
Absolutely. I think the data show us that being completely vaccinated is critically important, especially with viruses that spread as easily as Delta does.
Mr. Gopalakrishnan, any thoughts on how to get that message across, to persuade the last few people to get in there and get those jabs?
You just need to continue to message, continue to tell them that it's safe, continue to tell them, the number of people who have been vaccinated. And as the Professor Kang said, listen to their concerns, try and address them. We cannot force anybody to get vaccinated. But it's a dialogue that must continue. And we need to also tell them, right, if you look at children, right, they are taking lots of vaccines anyway from birth onwards. And, so this is a technology that has been proven to help humanity. So we need to, communicate.
Absolutely. Just keep on going. Just keep on getting that across. Do you feel that people are becoming complacent now? We see case numbers coming down as it was before the second wave. Hopefully no third wave. But do you feel that people are taking things a bit easier now?
It's very difficult to, put people into, constraints and tell them, you can't do this, you can't do that, you have to wear a mask always. It's not natural, right? And I think fatigue comes in after some time, how many days can you actually work from home? You just want to go out, meet people, have a meal together and things like that. So, I think we are going to a new normal. After 9/11, the security and things like that changed at public places, at the airports and things like that. We will now go into a phase where, for some time at least everybody will get tested before they travel. They'll have to show their vaccine certificates when they want to go into a public place. It's already happening in Europe, I see that now. So I think there will be some changes made to our life, and that's become the new normal for some time at least.
Absolutely. Professor Kang, do you think that, like other viruses, do you think that COVID has now become endemic, like dengue, like other things that we're dealing with?
Yes, I think the situation is an endemic situation now because we are seeing low levels of the virus continuing to occur over very wide geographies. And that is what endemic viruses are. You see them, it doesn't mean that there isn't seasonality, it doesn't mean that there will not be small outbreaks that will occur in places that have not seen the virus before. But it's not going anywhere.
It's not going anywhere. It cannot be eradicated. We're not looking like at a smallpox situation where we can get rid of it with vaccinations.
In theory, it can be eradicated. All it requires is for the entire world population to isolate themselves for 3 weeks. If that can be done.
That's all that's needed.
Very simple solution.
Absolutely simple. So it is there. It is something we have to live with. And the approach towards an endemic, something endemic, is very different then towards.
So I think that's something that we need to start building towards right now. So vaccination absolutely has to continue. We have to be looking at the development of wave 2, wave 3 vaccines, which might be better than the ones that we have today, that might result in broader, much longer lasting immune responses. But in addition to that, we have to think about, do we need booster doses? For whom? When do we need to think about them? When it comes to testing, who do you want to test? Why are you testing them? What will you do with that information? Do schools need regular testing? Should we test only for travel? What is our policy for incoming international travelers that come from places that have different variants circulating? So we need to think about testing, we need to think about vaccination, we need to think about healthcare. What do you need to provide at primary care around the country? What do you need to provide in a hospital which may require ICU care and ventilators? What makes them able to cope with what you predict the maximum number of cases are likely to be, and have some room left over for eventualities?
Yes, in case it's worse than considered. And to come back to that first point you raised, do we need booster doses?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Just like with children.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Now, Mr. Gopalakrishnan, during the time of the pandemic, we had a whole series of startups adapting to the new reality, whether it was things that made work from home easier, things that made communication easier. You're very much into looking at the startup field. What do you think is required, and what has been your response? Has there been anything which really impressed you over the last year and a half?
What impressed me most was the resilience shown by these startups. You know, if you just look at the number of unicorns that we produced in the last 9 months, right? It's the highest. It's just one measure. The flow of money shows the confidence in that system, right?
Yes.
So we have had the highest number of unicorns, and we have not heard of significant failures.
Okay.
There are a lot of healthcare startups that have come up, which again, because of the focus on both wellness as well as treatment and disease management, have sprung up now. I think these are all good things. I see the resilience of the startup ecosystem. I see the resilience of the larger companies. Where we have some challenges is in the middle, the MSME sector.
Yes.
That's where we need to probably think about how can we support them, how can we enable them, how can we make sure that there is a lot more credit flow into that MSME sector, and there may be requirement for large businesses to take them under their wing and support them also.
Okay.
Not just the government. So, multiple of these things should be looked at. MSME sector is where the challenge.
That is where the challenge is. The startup sector, you're saying, adapted pretty well.
Pretty well.
Okay.
Yes.
And finally, Professor Kang, to come back to the vaccine, Indian-made vaccines. Covaxin is still being looked at by the WHO. Your thoughts on the situation, and what do you think will happen, should happen? Another tough one.
No, I think with every vaccine going into a different environment, a different regulatory system, there is a challenge. So it's very important to recognize that while the Indian ecosystem made vaccines that were WHO pre-qualified and were used globally prior to the pandemic on a number of different kinds of technology platforms for routine immunization of children, the high-income countries in Europe and the US were not using our vaccines, even though our vaccines are significantly cheaper. So it's really about the regulatory environment and having the data that fits that environment. So I think getting it clear that you have all of the paperwork in place, that you respond to clarifications when required, is the best way to go. You can't change another regulator to fit your regulatory framework. We have to adapt to make sure that our products are fit for purpose, not just for us, but for the world.
Now, a big challenge, of course, this time round was getting the vaccines ready. It was a very, very quick effort indeed. And the challenge also of a new variant, which may make it a little more difficult. But do you think that the scientific community is now better prepared in case a new wave does come, if a new variant does come?
Well, it took us 10 months to get from sequence to results of the first vaccine, which was the Pfizer mRNA, completely new platform. But that completely new platform has the advantage of being able to make vaccines really quickly. I mean, the Moderna vaccine was designed over a weekend, 48 hours, and was in production and into humans 6 weeks later. So the challenge before us is how do we do things faster, not just for wave 2 of this pandemic or wave 2 vaccines for this pandemic, but future pandemics as well.
Yes.
So there is a global effort now to do two things. One is to make sure that we use every technology we have to make a vaccine from sequence data to human studies in 100 days.
In 100 days?
In 100 days, including regulatory processes.
Oh, that's a very positive thing in case something does come along around the corner.
Yes, and the second part of it is that there is an effort from multiple agencies to identify the 25 viral families that are likely to have pathogens that have the ability to cause pandemics, and to design and keep ready vaccines for those virus families. One of the advantages we had for SARS-CoV-2 was the work that had been done for vaccines for SARS-CoV-1 and for MERS. So if we can do this for the other 24 families, then we will be much better prepared to make vaccines much quicker next time around.
So the next pandemic, if it does come, we can be better prepared.
If it's a virus which can be handled with a vaccine, yes, we will be better prepared.
Thank you both so much. There has been some good news to take away from this. The unlikeliness of a third wave and the adaptability of India's scientific and startup community to a huge thing like dealing with the pandemic. Professor Gagandeep Kang and Mr. S. Gopalakrishnan, thank you very much for joining us here today on NDTV. Thank you so much.